Huzzah!
And thank you, Anna, for inviting me to the LaGrange Library. I'm Edwin Weiner, and I've been in radio since 1971. I've done TV work, I've written for newspapers and magazines, and I have a soft spot in my heart for old-time radio because my radio station, WGRC, back in 1978, did 2 hours, a 2-hour block of old-time radio every Sunday afternoon at 12 o'clock. And I don't think we had War of the Worlds on, but we had Jack Benny on, and we had Burns and Allen, and we had Fred Allen, who I was totally unfamiliar with in 1978. And we had the Inner Sanctum, and we had the Lone Ranger, and we had the Shadow, Lamont Cranston. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? Shadow does. Radio has been around for a long time. It's been around for the better part of 119 years, since 1901. But in 1938, Devil's Night, Gate Night, the night before Halloween, Orson Welles came up with an idea for the Mercury Arts Theater. He was going to create a show that seemed to have a crisis taking place during a big band dance. And this, of course, is the night before, Sunday night, Halloween, 1938. So Orson Welles puts on this thing called War of the Worlds, which was an adaptation from the H.G. Wells 1898 book, War of the Worlds, where the Martians invade Earth. And this got pretty serious. Now, let me give you some background on that. It was Sunday night. And on NBC, David Sarnoff's network, was the Edgar Bergen show, ventriloquist, with Mortimer Snerd, Charlie McCarthy, and eventually Edgar would have a daughter named Candace Bergen, who wrote a book, My Brother Charlie McCarthy, The Dummy. And so most people did not hear Orson Welles' show, War of the Worlds, until halfway in, because they listened to Bergen, which was a very popular show, and then switched the dial to the H.G. Wells book, which became part of the Mercury Arts Theater. Now, Wells himself stole the idea. Well, maybe not stole, but borrowed the idea. He's dead. You can't sue me anyway. He said he conceived of the idea of doing a radio broadcast in such a manner that a crisis would actually seem to be happening. This was done in 1926 on the BBC in England in a London studio. But Wells decided 12 years later he was going to do the same thing in America. And what he was going to do was basically have this big band music show and have bulletins interspersed into the show. And there is Orson Welles after the show. Now, I've been doing this talk for a long, long time, and unfortunately, because people have passed on, when I started doing this talk, they were about 70 and certainly remembered old-time radio rather well. There were very few people who do remember the glory days of old-time radio, which ended about 1953, which means that you had to be born in 1946, 47 to remember when radio was king. Wells has this idea, and he puts it on. And I was in Nyack, New York about 6-7 years ago, and there was this guy in his 90s, and he stops me, and he says, I want to say something. I said, go ahead. He says, we listened to that show. We were all little kids, that show. We lived in Princeton, and Grover's Mill, where the Martians allegedly landed, was right down the road from us. And my father got really scared listening to the show, so he rounds up the kids. We run into the garage, and he says, pick up anything you can, a rake, a hoe, a shovel. We're going to beat back these Martians. They weren't the only ones that were afraid of this. CBS's switchboard is overwhelmed, so overwhelmed that the actors on the show have to start answering phones and try to assure a public, a panicking public, that this thing wasn't real. It was just a drama. This wasn't really happening. People were calling their local police departments, trying to find out how to protect themselves against the Martians. The Martians were coming, and Wells' production was so realistic on radio. And remember, people used to watch radio and they just stare catatonically at the radio. They wouldn't even blink. They'd be watching radio, just watching radio. And it was a problem. The police departments didn't know anything about it. They didn't get any reports other than from people who were listening to the show. And the actors are trying to calm down people. The switchboard operators are trying to do the same. Meanwhile, you got this guy in Princeton running down to Grover's Mill with his family, and they're about ready to take rakes and shovels and hose to beat off the Martians. It was, the first 2/3 of the hour was a 1-hour broadcast that was presented within the first 2/3 as a series of simulated news bulletins. It was a drama. That's all it was, but people took it seriously. So seriously that they took up the arms best they could to fight off the Martians. The show was over. It was a drama. That was it. It was done. Wells is meeting with the media because there's such a hubbub around the country about this. Wells realizes everybody else connected with radio at this point realizes, hey, this stuff reaches people. It reaches a lot of people. And people listen intently to radio. Radio, in a funny way, had made it as a major medium, even though it was the only medium that people had for entertainment at home, reaches the apex on October 30th, 1938. Of course, in the end, it was just a radio show. And this was who people were worried about. Marvin the Martian. Well, he would come later in the Warner Brothers cartoon. Did you ever notice Marvin the Martian doesn't have a mouth? I was talking to a friend of mine who actually taught at Spring Valley High School. When I was at Spring Valley High School in 1972, we overlapped Spring Valley High School in Rockland County, where I got my start in radio on WRKL radio, doing a 15-minute weekly show called Tiger Talk, the name of our high school. And his name is Martin Mackover, and he was a communications teacher. We overlapped. I graduated in 73. He came in 72, 73, but we didn't have each other. And he told me the first couple of years of his teaching career, he got a copy of War of the Worlds, and he played it for his class. And he said the kids were laughing. They couldn't believe that people were scared off by reports of Martians landing on Earth. So he just said, no, I'm not doing this anymore. To make a long story short, Martin said it just wasn't worth it. They just didn't take it seriously. But to make a long story short, they still celebrate War of the Worlds in Grover Mills, New Jersey. Every Gate Night, every Devil's Night, October 30th of every year, they have a parade celebrating the 1938 radio broadcast of War of the Worlds. At the end of the day, it was just a radio show. But it just showed how powerful at that point in history in the United States, radio really was. And people would sit, now I used to have people when I was in a venue, and this is going back 20 years, rarely do you have this anymore when I do this live, but you used to have people who would sit in front of the radio. That's not quite a cathedral radio, but radios were furniture pieces back in those days. And they would sit in front of the radio and watch the radio. In Nyack a few years ago, and that guy who I told the story about Princeton was also in Nyack and gave talks there over the years. And this woman was telling me that when she was probably that age, she and her sister would go into a room, put on the radio, put on the inner sanctum. And the instructions on the inner sanctum were to experience the best listening experience. Shut off the lights and just listen. And she and her sister would go in there and they would hold hands, listening, scared out of their wits, but they'd listen to the show. It was supposed to be a scary show, and you provided some of the atmosphere by shutting the lights and imagine what's going on. Imagine what was going on down near Princeton. Imagine listening to all these shows like the Jack Benny show with the Maxwell and Ed in the vault who hadn't seen lights since the Spanish-American War in 1898. Now, I speak a lot on cruise ships, or I used to speak a lot on cruise ships. We'll see if that happens again when they get up and going, once the COVID-19, the virus is contained and there are treatments for it and maybe a vaccine. That is St. John's, Newfoundland. That is Signal Hill. And on top of Signal Hill is this little area that Marconi camped out. Marconi was one of the people who helped put together and invent radio. And he comes from England and he moves over to Newfoundland, which is not really part of Canada. It was a Canadian territory. It wasn't a province. Now you sail into St. John and you look up, and on the left side of the ship as you leave, or the right side as you come in, you see this little structure. And that is where Marconi was, taking in the first signal from Cornwall, UK in 1901. And the first transatlantic wireless transmission from Cornwall, UK was on December 12, 1901. And for all intents and purposes, that starts radio. That's my Grundig radio. That radio is probably 70 years old. Kind of still works. I haven't put it on in a long time. And one of the reasons, there are tubes in the back of that radio. And if any of the tubes burn out, I have no idea where I go to replace the tubes, although I'm pretty sure on eBay or maybe even Amazon, I can find it. And you got your short wave radio on there. You had the FM on there, which was unusual for radios in around 1950, 1951. And you had your AM band, which was the predominant band. FM would come into prominence in the 1960s. It's not that old compared to the AM band. The United States, radio in the United States was born in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And the exact date was April 15th, and that was 1912. And if anybody wants to answer this in chat, which they could, what was April 15th, 1912 famous for? And don't say you have to get your taxes in, because your taxes had to be in by March 15th of a given year. Anybody know what happened on
Titanic?
Titanic sunk. The Titanic sunk. And there was a guy in New York at the John Wanamaker store at the Marconi wireless station in the John Wanamaker store in Manhattan by the name of David Sarnoff. David Sarnoff was getting the SOS signals from the Halifax area. Save our ship. The Titanic was going down. And it would be Sarnoff who would be getting the transmissions from the Halifax area into the United States. Who survived, who didn't survive. And he would be telling people, your loved one passed away, your loved one is safe, and will be returning home at some point. With that, Sarnoff gets an idea, and he decides, you know, maybe, just maybe, we could use some of that radio spectrum to actually have commercial radio. Sarnoff was the manager of the Marconi wireless station at the Wanamaker department store in New York City. And for those who are too young to know what Wanamaker's was, John Wanamaker's was a department store in New York, in Philadelphia, the Milrose Games. At the Milrose Games, it was known as the John Wanamaker Mile. That was the signature race in the Milrose Games until the Wanamaker stores went out of business, probably in the mid-1980s to the late 1980s, and wasn't a very big chain. It was just New York, Philadelphia, Yonkers, a couple other places. So the sinking of the Titanic brings radio into the public spotlight. The United States Congress is asked to regulate a certain part of the spectrum to give to people like Sarnoff and to ham operators, literally ham operators, small station operators, to broadcast. And there was pressure put on Congress. And after World War I, there is David Sarnoff, General Sarnoff, who founded NBC Radio in 1926 and NBC Television in 1939. The Radio Corporation of America, and Sarnoff had moved there by this point, gets the Marconi radio station from the U.S. Navy, and David Sarnoff begins to go to work to make radio possible in the United States. Now, it was Sarnoff who was doing this in New York, and George Westinghouse and the Westinghouse Labs were doing this in Pittsburgh as well. Westinghouse was developing radio and had a little radio station, and eventually Westinghouse would come up with a device a tube, so to speak, the first picture tube, and that was 1921, 1922. November 2nd, 1920, KDKA in Pittsburgh, where George Westinghouse was, becomes the first broadcast commercial license station. The first thing that was ever broadcast on KDKA, which still today 50,000 watts, 50,000 watts unabated in 1920 meant it could go to the Mississippi, into Canada, Newfoundland, New England, the Northeast, mid-Atlantic states, the South, and maybe parts of past the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. The Harding-James Cox presidential election returns are broadcast by Leo Rosenberg, who starts at 6 o'clock Eastern time, and there was no exit polls in those days. It was just rip and read. You got something from the wire, you just ripped it and read it, and that was it. But that was the first, at least on radio, presidential election returns. But this thing, this picture here that you see, this is a key to radio growing. On the left is Jack Dempsey. And Jack Dempsey was kind of a controversial character in 1921 because he didn't serve in the armed forces, Army or Navy, and there was there were kind of planes around that it wasn't really an air force, but some planes were doing battle back in 1917 and 1918. And there's Dempsey, and Dempsey was accused of being a draft dodger, or deadbeat, or whatever, and he claimed he was the sole breadwinner for his family. And on the right, the guy there is from France. It's George Carpentier. There are 90,000 people in this arena, which is all wooden, called Boyle's 30 Acres in Jersey City. This is the largest arena in the world at this point, just on an open field with some wooden stands in Jersey City. And David Sarnoff's trying to figure out, how do I build a radio station? How do I build a bunch of radio stations? Well, if we have a radio station, we need more than just some static. I mean, we could have all the static, and we need more than a local operator of the station just talking day and night. Nobody's going to listen to that day and night, so we need programming. So he decides, you know what, there's this Dempsey fight with Carpentier. Why don't I try to broadcast it? It's a big deal. There are 90,000 people that bought tickets to this thing, and it features Jack Dempsey. It was Jack Dempsey. It was Babe Ruth. It was Al Jolson. It was Rudolph Valentino. That were some of the major stars of the 1920s, and known internationally. And so he decides, why don't I give it a go? Why don't I see if I could broadcast this? And this is where sports media rights fees would start. David Sarnoff figured it all out. RCA needed to sell radios, but for RCA to sell radios, he needed programming, which makes sense, right? You would think that. It needed music, it needed news, it needed sports. And he is going to deliver. July 2nd, 1921, he arranges the broadcast of the Jack Dempsey-Carpentier fight. It was very primitive, extremely primitive. Some of it was done out of the studio with wire services going into the studio. Some of it was actually on the site. Within 3 years, the radio music box, the name was Radiola. It was $75. Within 3 years, RCA had sales of $83.5 million. People listened to the fight. people wanted content, and David Sarnoff gave them content. The big fight, well, July 2nd, 1921, was at Boyle's 30 Acres in Jersey City, New Jersey. It was the first $1 million gate in boxing history. Crowd of 91,000 watched the fight. Sarnoff and RCA arranged live coverage of the match through KDKA in Pittsburgh, first national broadcast. KDKA was the only one on, so it had to be a national broadcast. It was big news. It was absolute big news. There is Dempsey out of Montana. He wins the fight, 4-round knockout over Carpentier, 12 rounds. But the big news of the day, people bought a radio to listen to the fight. Radio could make it. Actually, the first fight was on April 11th, 1921 on radio, on KDKA in Pittsburgh. A broadcast, 10-round, no decision fight between Johnny Ray and Johnny Dundee in Pittsburgh's Motor Square Garden. And there is Johnny Ray. Now, it isn't the Johnny Ray who sung Crying. Doesn't look like he's a real tough guy, does he? Look at those two guys holding up a background for him so they can take a picture. But Johnny Ray was in the first fight with Dundee that was on radio. First baseball game, August 5th, 1921, on the heels of the Dempsey fight, also on KDKA, a game between the Pittsburgh Pirates and the Philadelphia Phillies. Now, Warren G. Harding as a president is ranked in the bottom, scandal-filled 2-year term. He died of a heart attack, allegedly, in San Francisco in 1923. But he did have the first radio installed in the White House. And I'm not sure what he's looking at or what the photographer was trying to do getting this picture. But it looks to me that Warren Harding is just looking into an empty cylinder. Former newspaper editor in Ohio. But that was February 8th, 1922. He passed away in 1923. 2 years later, Calvin Coolidge, who followed Harding, was the first president to broadcast from the White House. It was on Washington's birthday, February 22nd, 1924. Those days they celebrated birthdays on the birthdays, not on the third Monday of February. And it was heard on now 42 stations from coast to coast. 1923, Sarnoff again decided, hey, let's try baseball. And we're going to do it on WEAF 660 on the AM dial, which would become WNBC eventually. And now it's WFAN, which simulcasts WFAN FM, where it's all sports all the time. 1923, Sarnoff decides, let's get this World Series for our stations. And there's only one reason why. It's the guy on the left, Babe Ruth. People could begin hearing Babe Ruth hitting home runs on radio. And take a look at that uniform. Yeah, they got the pinstripes, but it's not the blue hat. And it's kind of a weird New York logo there. And look at the striped socks, vertical striped socks, horizontal striped socks, I'm sorry. And there is Babe Ruth, and he's the star. And that's why Sarnoff wanted the games on his radio stations. Calvin Coolidge, hey, he's tooling around the town. Take a look at where the speaker is put in the car that the president is. It's on the outside. It was not on the inside because there was no such thing as a small speaker at that point. The night before the 1924 election, Coolidge made history. Largest radio audience ever to hear a broadcast. It was his final campaign speech. Coolidge won the election. On March 3rd, 1925, Americans listened for the first time to the president take the oath of office on radio. That would be changed during the Roosevelt years from March 3rd, whatever year it was, to January 20th, when the president is sworn in. It used to be that winter months, it was difficult to travel in those days by horse or whatever. So have it in March when the weather is better. But they moved it back to January 20th during the Roosevelt administration. Now, Britain's all appalled by all this, what's going on in the United States. Sarnoff is not only forming a network, but he also is selling time to companies. You want to buy a whole block of time, you can buy a whole block of time. You want to buy 60 seconds, you can buy 60 seconds. In Britain, they decided that the best way, the absolute best way to support radio is you buy a radio and you pay a tax on the radio, and the tax would go to the BBC. Sarnoff decides, no, I'm not doing it this way, and the Brits are really upset because they think their way is the best, subscription radio. But in England, they had competition by 1934, free competition, Radio Luxembourg, 200,000 watts of power. We had 1,000 at WRKL. We had 500 at WGRC. 2,000-watt transmitters to send commercial radio all across Europe. In a lot of ways, the Beatles owe some of their success to Radio Luxembourg because they were playing Beatles records across the continent in 1963, Radio Luxembourg. In Argentina, programs from the United States, music from the United States became popular because of radio. And why was radio popular in Argentina? Well, there was a fight between Firpo and Jack Dempsey in 1923, carried in Argentina, and Argentinians liked radio. NBC Red, Sarnoff gets into the network business. NBC Red, that is the first commercial network that Sarnoff introduces. NBC Red is the flagship network. They have established shows. They have advertisers. While NBC Blue is kind of, the best way you could compare it to is C-SPAN today. They had sustaining shows. They had news shows, public affairs shows. On NBC Red, radio plays, mysteries, adventures, detective serials, soap operas, quiz shows, variety hours, talent shows. Major Beau's talent show, 1938. Frank Sinatra never won Major Beau's talent show. He was there, I think, as part of the Hoboken Four. And there's William Paley. William Paley would start WCAU radio in Philadelphia in 1927. Call letters have been retired. I don't know why, but new owners, new call letters. WCAU was the first of the CBS, Columbia Broadcasting Systems stations, radio in Philadelphia in 1927, and they too, by 1940, the Paley people get into television. What NBC's Blues did was headlines, remote reporting, sidewalk interviews, panel discussions, weather reports, farm reports. In the 1960s, WABC, the All-Americans, WABC with cousin Brucey and Dan Ingram and Herb Oscar Anderson in the morning used to do farm reports at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I worked with a guy named Charlie Greer, who was on WABC in the 1970s. I worked with him, and I once asked Charlie Greer, who was with WABC, the overnight guy, why farm reports? He said the radio station license, they were worried because the radio station could boom out to Nebraska and into the plains. And they were worried about losing their license because it wasn't giving programming that local community wanted. So they threw farm reports on at 3 o'clock in the morning, Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the Agriculture Report, all stuff that me as an 8-year-old in Woodside, Queens didn't really care about. But the bosses at WABC, Music Radio 77 in New York, were worried about their license and figured that they had to do these farm reports. I don't know, in Queens on the blacktop, I never really thought about how the hog market was doing, but somebody at WABC did. NBC Radio's Red Network had their first newscast on February 24th, 1930. Floyd Gibbons, who was a well-known newspaper correspondent in the early 20s, was the announcer. Now, you're not too far away in LaGrange from Pauling, New York. Lowell Thomas. Lowell Thomas was a radio commentator, but Lowell Thomas made his name by telling tales of Lawrence of Arabia. And that was his big deal before he got to radio, the tales of Lawrence of Arabia, which you probably have some of the books in your library of Lawrence of Arabia. September 29th, 1930, Lowell Thomas hosted his first CBS show, daily news show. He worked for CBS and NBC. The radio program, Lowell Thomas in the News, usually ended with the words "so long until tomorrow," and there was a final "so long" in 1974 for Lowell Thomas. Before Thomas became a radio commentator, he was a travel adventure writer, best known for his stories about Lawrence of Arabia. Also in the 1930s, he got into film work. He worked as an announcer for the Fox Movie Tone newsreels, where they would have some film of what happened that week, and he would do the voiceover on it. 1976 rather, May 14th, 1976 was the last edition of the Lowell Thomas Show. He lasted 46 years. And if you do go up to Pauling and just drive through Pauling and see Edwin Armstrong's old house, or you could see Sally Jesse Raphael's house. She lives there as well. And the Trump boys live there as well, or spend time there as well, Eric and Donald Jr., up in Pauling. You will find a rock, and on the corner of the rock, there's a little plaque dedicated to Lowell Thomas, real estate agent as well. He brought up a lot of his radio colleagues like Morrow and others to Pauling, and they were there sometimes on weekends, sometimes they commuted back and forth to Manhattan, but Lowell Thomas has his imprint all over Pauling. Well, Jack Benny on the left. Young people don't know who Jack Benny is today. I have a comic friend by the name of Max Tocelli, king of the cruise ship. He was on cruise ships in the 80s, 90s, into the 21st century, and he made a lot of appearances on cruise ships, spent a lot of time on cruise ships. And he was doing a land presentation about a year ago, and he was telling me about it. And he said that there was a young comedian there, and he decided, small talk. He said, who are your favorite comedians? And he named a bunch of contemporary comedians, and Robin Williams was one, but no old timers. And he said, did you ever hear of Jack Benny? No, never heard of Jack Benny. He said, you're a comic? The master of timing. Everybody paid attention to Jack Benny for his timing. But there's a new crop. Jack Benny has been dead since 1974, and his glory years were in the 1930s and 1940s. And there's Jack with Mary Livingston and Eddie Anderson, Rochester. And I talked about timing. And it took a while for Jack Benny to develop this character, for Rochester to develop his character. Jack Benny started in 1932 on NBC. And he comes up with this character, and older people know the character. He's vain, he has blue eyes, he walks like a dame, he walks like a woman. He's envious, he's a miser, he's got a guy guarding his bank vault who hadn't seen the light of day since 1898, and there would always be questions. Did we win the war? Jack Benny said, what war? And he says, the one with Teddy Roosevelt. Oh, we won that, and we won the World War I as well. It took a while for that character to develop, and it develops by the mid-1940s. And Benny's a big, big radio star. His program is extremely popular on NBC. Beats out Kate Smith. Kate Smith had Abbott Costello on in 1938, and Abbott Costello debuted Who's on First on the Kate Smith show. Anybody who's anybody had a show back in those days. But anyway, getting back to Benny. So Benny's character is developed on Ronald Colman, who is an English actor of the 30s and 40s, great English actor in terms of his voice. His diction was great. And allegedly, he lived next door to Jack Benny. He really didn't. He lived somewhere around there, but didn't. And Benny was envious of a lot of things. And he sees Ronald Colman's Oscar, and Jack Benny never won an Oscar. And he looks at the Oscar, and he's leaving Ronald Colman's house, and he sticks the Oscar inside his jacket and walks home, where all of a sudden he's held up. Buddy, this is a stick-up. I said, buddy, this is a stick-up. Buddy, this is a stick-up. Your money or your life? I said your money or your life? I'm thinking. With that, Jack Benny gets the biggest laugh ever in the history of radio. The biggest laugh ever. So much so that it came at the end of the show when they had to redo the show. They used to do 2 shows, one for the East Coast, one for the West Coast. When they had to redo the show, they had to edit it down to make sure that they got it off on time, because this one ran 32 minutes. And it was the biggest laugh. Benny's timing was impeccable, absolutely impeccable. The voice of Bugs Bunny, Mel Blanc, was on the Jack Benny show. He did the voice of the robber. He did the voice of the long-suffering Professor LeBlanc, his Jack Benny's violin teacher, because that was the other joke, that he couldn't play the violin. Mary was a wisecracking girlfriend, not a wife. And Rochester's character was kind of interesting, the evolution. Initially, he was just on the train, and he was steward on the train, and he happened to serve Jack Benny. And then he would become the valet, but he would become the valet with all the stereotypes connected with Negroes back in the 1930s. And Benny said, no, he's an equal character to all of us. And they changed the character. He wasn't playing dice anymore. He wasn't gambling. And Benny presented Rochester as one of the cast. He was one of them. He was an integral part of one of them, and interacted with Dennis Day and Don Wilson and Phil Harris. And Benny made no big deal out of it. And Eddie Anderson was one of the most popular people on radio, and also did some politics on the side, and he liked to fly planes as well. But Benny opened the door for him. That is Toscanini. Sarnoff said he needed a lot of stuff. Toscanini would do the Metropolitan Opera and the NBC Orchestra on radio. And that's George Gershwin. George Gershwin could pop up on the Fleischmann's Yeast show starring Rudy Valley, and he might be doing one of his new compositions. I'm going to introduce you to a new composition, Fascinating Rhythm, and doing variations of Fascinating Rhythm. But again, you needed radio. If you were a star, you needed radio. Even if you weren't a star, that got you the exposure. I'll give you a story about Pal Crosby, WLW Radio in Cincinnati. Pal Crosby was really rich, extremely rich. He owned WLW, actually he owned 2 radio stations in Cincinnati, but WLW, which you can get now, it's 50,000 watts. If you play around with a radio, you know, need your iHeart app or whatever, radio.com app to listen, whatever they're affiliated with. But back in the day, you could listen to it at night because of the way the signals bounced. And so WLW, he buys the Cincinnati Reds, Pal Crosby, to put it on WLW for programming. On Saturday nights, a lot of stations, virtually every station had some sort of big band show. New York was from the Cotton Club. In Cincinnati, he hired a local talent for his Saturday night show. There was always a boy singer and a girl singer. The girl singer in Cincinnati happened to be a local girl by the name of Doris Day, who recently passed away. She was replaced by the mother of a guy I know, and his name is Cameron, Dave Cameron, Doug Cameron rather, and his mother's name was Barbara Cameron. She ended up writing the song, the Looney Tunes song for Roadrunner for the 1961 cartoon. Every city had a big star. Every city had a big star, and some were bigger than others. Wilkes-Barre, ballroom dancing, Hit Parade, big shows on radio. The oldest show still going on radio is out of Nashville. It's the Grand Ole Opry. Started in 1929, sponsored by a detergent. That's why it's called the Old Opry. Soap operas too. It started in 1929. I was in Nashville in 2001 or 2002, one of those years. And I went to the Grand Ole Opry, not expecting much, and it was one of the great musical events I've ever attended. It's a weekly thing. It's really a radio show. It's got a big stage. We happened to see it in the old church cathedral, the Ryman Auditorium. We didn't see it at the new place. That's where you want to see the Grand Ole Opry. And all these guys just stand around on stage waiting for their turn to be called. Porter Wagner was the MC that night telling some jokes. And if you looked up, there was the WSM booth where the announcer is looking down at what's going on in the Grand Ole Opry. It is still going strong 91 years later in Nashville. That started back in 1929. Superman on radio. Now, the Superman on radio bears some resemblance to the Superman in the comics. The Superman on TV bears some resemblance to the Superman on radio. And the Superman movies bear resemblance to television. The Superman comic came first. Then came the show on WOR radio in 1940. And the announcer was a guy by the name of Clayton Collier, or Bud Collier, who would go on to TV, host Beat the Clock to Tell the Truth, some other game shows along with Miss USA pageants. I think he was the announcer for the Miss USA pageant in 1963, not Miss Teen USA, when Diane Sawyer was Miss Teen USA back in 1963. Superman on radio did not follow Superman in the comics. Started on February 12, 1940. Runs on Mutual Radio. I worked for Mutual Radio, not on WOR, but I worked for Mutual Radio. August 31st, 1942 to February 14th, 1949. Now we all know that Superman has a problem with kryptonite. But why does he have a problem with kryptonite? He has a problem with kryptonite. Well, Bud Collier was doing about 7 or 8 or 9 shows. And he was also the voice of Superman. And he was also the voice of Clark Kent. And he was kind of burnt out. He wanted a vacation doing all the shows. He started out as a lawyer. His sister was a movie actress, and he decided that he wanted to go into entertainment. Didn't like being a lawyer. So had a good voice. He found a lot of work in New York. And he's the voice of both Superman and also the voice of Clark Kent. So here's the problem. He wants to take a vacation. And the people writing the show, the producers of the show, realize that, yeah, you know what? He should have a vacation. But what are we going to do? Well, replacing Clark Kent's no big deal. We don't need Clark Kent, but we need Superman. So what are we going to do? We got to do something. Well, if we get him sick somehow, we can hire an actor just to go, and build up scripts. It's a good thing. We could do that. We could actually do that. Okay, now we got to come up with something. We have to come up with something. Well, what are we going to come up with? Well, it comes from Krypton, right? Well, let's figure about Krypton. Superman has superpowers on Earth because the sun is yellow. Krypton's sun is red. Kryptonite blocks out that ability. And with a red thing, kryptonite is no big deal because of the sun being yellow. Its radiation, though, is poisonous to kryptonites if they're exposed to it. Could kill them. That's it. We got it. We got it. Okay, Bud, you can go on vacation. He does. They hire an actor. Takes a vacation, comes back, cure him. They get the kryptonite away from him, and he's back in the saddle saving the world. Now, there's Bud Collier reading the Superman comic strip. The Superman comic strip did not follow the radio show for about 4 years. That happened in 1943. 1947 is when the comic strip caught up to the radio show. Franklin Roosevelt, using the Twitter of his day, the fireside chats, talking directly to the American public without the filter, or what he thought was the filter of news people. Like I said, if you were anybody in radio or in entertainment, you had a radio show, like Al Jolson had a radio show. And of course, Benny, Eddie Cantor, in the morning, in the evening, we had fun, and he'd roll his eyes, and he had his great song was Making Whoopee, and Bing Crosby. This still is from Bugs Bunny cartoon. The Bugs Bunny cartoon. The Bugs Bunny cartoon is called What's Up, Doc? And it goes over the life story of Bugs Bunny and how he meets Elmer Fudd. And he's on Skid Row with these guys. And Elmer Fudd sees Bugs Bunny and he says something to the effect, "Bugs Bunny, what are you doing here with these has-beens?" They were all has-beens. And Bugs Bunny's ears pop up, they form a comedy team, and the rest is history. At least the history of 1950 with Bugs Bunny. They had other histories of Bugs Bunny, but anybody who's anybody had a radio show. Abbott and Costello, after they broke out on the Kate Smith show. Fred Allen at Allen's Alley. Victor Borger had a show. Jimmy Durante and Gary Moore were on shows together, Gary Moore being the straight man, then went on to a TV career. Phil Harris was Jack Benny's band leader and then had his own shows. Bob Hope, a whole bunch of others. And then you could have these shows, Amos and Andy, which started in 1927. White actors playing the role of Amos and Andy on WGN in Chicago. That eventually would go to TV around 1953. Burns and Allen, Fibber McGee and Molly, the Goldbergs, and the Great Gildersleeves, better known as the Great Gildersleeves in Warner Brothers' The Bugs Bunny cartoons. And there is Groucho. Groucho and Chico had shows. They were totally different. Chico's show was a music show. His drummer, Mel Torme. Groucho's show was You Bet Your Life. You Bet Your Life. And it started on radio before getting to TV. And that is where most people know You Bet Your Life on TV. But there was an incident on radio, taped shows in San Francisco. And actually, I use it for my TV talk, but I'll use it for the radio talk. He's talking to Marion and Charlotte Story. George Fenneman brings them out. Mr. and Mrs. Story meet Groucho Marx. Groucho Marx meet Mr. and Mrs. Story. And Groucho says, Mr. and Mrs. Story, you have 20 children. And Mrs. Story, Marion Story, says, yes. And he says, why do you have 20 children? And Marion Story says, rather Charlotte Story says, I love my husband. Groucho says, I love my cigar too, but I take it out of my mouth every once in a while. Some guy had to explain it to his wife. I was in Tarrytown telling that story. His wife was like that, giving him the elbow. Tell it to you later. She didn't understand the story. Groucho. It happened on radio. Blondie, the comic strips, Blondie, Dick Tracy, Gasoline Alley, the Gumps, Little Abner, Little Orphan Annie. Who's that girl? Who's that little girl with the golden locks? It's Little Orphan Annie. Popeye the Sailor Man. All had radio shows. As an aside here, I knew Thomas Meehan back in the 1970s. He's the one that got away in my professional life. He ended up partnering with Mel Brooks on Spaceballs and the producers on Broadway. And he did Annie on Broadway. And he told me that when he and his partner, Charles Strauss, got the rights to Annie, he doesn't know why he got it. He said he hated Annie. He said Daddy Warbucks was a despicable guy. Somehow, Tom Meehan and the other people turned Daddy Warbucks and the others into lovable characters on Broadway to play Annie. And if you give me an email, I will send you that story. So I did that story for the Rockland Review in 1978. He's the guy that got away. I should have kept up with him. And we were friendly for a little while, but I was 23 and he was in his 40s. Ovaltine. Ovaltine. Ovaltine was a big deal. It was the sponsor of Captain Midnight's Secret Squadron. That is a ring that you could get by taking the two inner seals, taking them, putting them in self-addressed stamped envelope, sending them somewhere, and they sent you back this, a ring. And there was a guy who nearly killed this story for me because he almost told the thing, shh, quiet. Now, Ovaltine, if you notice that picture, you see the numbers 1 through 26, and you see corresponding letters underneath the 1 through 26. It's all plastic and you turn that thing around. And every week you got a clue from the Captain's Midnight Secret Squadron Ovaltine commercial. You got a clue as to what number or letter, and you start with play Hangman. And you kept playing till you figured out we figured out that the secret, super secret squadron message was, drink Ovaltine. That guy had a ring, so it was worth about $500 in decent shape. Edwin Armstrong news started on radio in 1938. They used to, the news people would just take newspapers and read out of newspapers till newspapers decided that's not good, and they were going to sue radio stations. So radio stations decided, let's have our own news departments. Insider secret, we did the same thing in 1978, 79, and 80. We used to take stories out of the newspapers and just rewrote it, and I'm sure they're still doing it today. That is the USS Arizona Monument, Pearl Harbor, where I was at in 2005. And the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th in 1941. And that's John Charles Daly, a young John Charles Daly who was with CBS Radio, who told at least American audiences that Pearl Harbor was bombed. And this is where life imitates Orson Welles. There is a show on. It's an opera show that's on, and it's interspersed with bulletins from John Charles Daly. Pearl Harbor has been bombed, back with more in a few minutes. And that kept going and going and going. So maybe Orson Welles' show wasn't that far off. The old redhead Arthur Godfrey was on from about 1945 to 1972 on CBS Radio every morning. There he is with a cigarette in his hand, no doubt at Chesterfield. He ended up with lung cancer, had one of his lungs removed. Arthur Godfrey was a ukulele player who would sing in the morning, tell stories, monologues, interviews, music, regular vocalist. Julius Larosa was not on his radio show. He was on his TV show. I worked with Julie over at WNEW. We used to see him at Shea Stadium because he sings anthems, sung anthems. Julie ended up retiring in Palm Springs, California, where he was a member of that prestigious club, the Romeos. Retired old men eating out. Jerry Vale was also part of that group. Julie once told me that Arthur Godfrey did not fire him. He was leaving the show, and it was kind of lost in the translation when Arthur Godfrey said this is his swan song. People thought Julie was fired. He wasn't. And Julie told me that he wasn't. And also I found out from others when Arthur Godfrey was on his deathbed, the only person who showed up from entertainment was Julius Larosa. He was a real prince of a guy. He didn't have to talk to a 23-year-old guy like me, take me seriously back 1979, 1980, but he did. And he was just a grand guy, and always sent notes to people. He was just such a wonderful, wonderful guy. And there's Edwin Armstrong, and he did a lot for radio. He probably did the most for radio because he invented FM radio, which would ultimately cost him his life. That is the Yonkers Library on Central Avenue, and there's a Yonkers Hall of Fame. Joe Lapchick is in there, Sid Caesar is in there, Ella Fitzgerald is in there. He is number 4 on the list, and of course, he's only numbered there so you could read his biography. And he played around and invented FM radio. David Sarnoff at NBC did not like the fact that Edwin Armstrong invented FM radio, and he invented it on the dial 40 through 60 on the spectrum. And Sarnoff didn't like Armstrong because he thought he'd be a threat, because he heard FM radio absolutely clear. AM radio was filled with static. Armstrong's radio was easier to listen to. So David Sarnoff, who had a lot of sway with the government, goes before the Federal Communications Commission in 1945, and he does not want them to keep Armstrong's frequencies at 40 through 60. And they don't. They move it to 88 to 108 megahertz. And Sarnoff doesn't kill Armstrong, doesn't kill him, but he kills his radio network, which was called the Yankee Radio Network, on June 27, 1945. He also, remember, RCA is making radios. He also kills off all of the FM sets that were produced through 1945 by various companies, causing those companies to lose a lot of money. Armstrong tried to sue Sarnoff for years and years. He would end up striking his wife, this is in the 1950s, and then realizing what he did, he ran to a hotel in Manhattan, took a room at the very top of the hotel, opened the window, plunged out, killed himself. Sarnoff said, I didn't kill Armstrong. He technically didn't, but all the lawsuits, the loss of FM, everything else just killed Armstrong's spirit, and he killed himself. We are reaching the end of radio's years of enduring popularity, because television is starting in 1946 with Dumont, CBS, and NBC. Eventually there'd be ABC TV. The radio people would move over to TV, some very successfully, a lot of them not. The last radio experiment was Monitor on NBC. They had all kinds of people, like Gene Rayburn, who ended up getting glory as a game show host on TV. But Rayburn would do a weekend show on Monitor. Henry Morgan did, Bill Cullen did, Gene Shepard, a whole bunch of people. And it was basically a network-wide or a nationwide network of shows with interesting people, talented people who could tell stories, maybe spin records, maybe interview people. It was Monitor. It just went from there to there, and it ends in the 1970s. And it's really the last great radio network show. No, you could say Garrison Keillor on NPR, who did that show, was the last great radio show of that genre. Eventually, AM radio would play music, top 40, American standards. Eventually, FM would start. Rock and roll in Cleveland. Ellen Freed, the Moondog House, nightly at 11:15 to 1 a.m. on WJR radio in Cleveland. He spins them. Kept. He's hep. That Freed. Ellen Freed would get in trouble taking payola, and eventually would suffer because he was not allowed on radio anymore after he took money for pushing, say, people, I don't know, like Simon and Garfunkel, Tom and Jerry. Actually, it's Dick Clark who pushed Tom and Jerry, Simon and Garfunkel. And if you read the biographies of Simon or Garfunkel, you find out that Dick Clark was on the take as well, but somehow he was never touched in the payola scandal. Ellen Freed was, but I think it was a $143 check that Simon and Garfunkel individually got, and Dick Clark took it because he promoted their record. And Freed said he didn't see anything wrong with payola. He was giving somebody a chance to make more money. Now, I was in the Henry Ford Museum 3 years ago. I would love to own that car, 1956 Chevy. AM radios only, and there's no pair of fuzzy dice in there, but they do have the Dagmar bumpers. For those of you who don't know who Dagmar was, she was Kim Kardashian in the 1950-51 years, and she too had major assets, except hers were on her chest. Some designer at General Motors really liked Dagmar, and decided that for whatever reason, those are the Dagmar bumpers. Cones on the front of the bumpers. They didn't do anything, but they were on Cadillacs, they were on Chevrolets and other GM cars. But there's no AM radio in there, FM radio in there. Eventually, radios would get the FM band, and Sarnoff's RCA's radios would have the FM band as well. And that would happen in the late 1950s and into the 60s. That is me in between the L and the I in Cleveland, Ohio in September of 2017. Long live rock and roll, the Rock and Roll Museum in Cleveland. And that was a disappointment for me because it was mostly a Rolling Stones museum, not the Rolling Stones group, the Rolling Stone magazine. And that took up 2 of 4 floors. But FM fell in love with rock and roll and rock. WNEW FM in New York, when they were getting going on the FM, tried an experiment. They had women disc jockeys, just women disc jockeys. Only 2 would survive. One, Alison Steele, the Nightbird, and the other, well, she didn't really survive in radio. She made her career in television. Sally Jesse Raphael. And she lives over in Pawling, New York, in what looks like a haunted house, and the locals refer to it as a local house. It looks like a gaudy house, G-A-U-D-I, in Spain, in Barcelona. But FM embraced rock, and then AM went to talk radio. And remember I told you, well, no, actually, back in 1979, that's me and Jack Kemp, congressman. And I used to have long curly hair back in those days. I'm all of 22, 23 years old, interviewing the congressman from Western New York. Eventually, he would run for vice president, as he said, in the worst way in 1996 as on the Republican ticket with Robert Dole. I had a 30-year relationship with Jack Kemp. I showed him that picture one day about 20 years later, and he looks at me and he said, "What happened to your hair?" And I said, "What happened to your wig? It's grayer now." But I had a fun relationship with Jack Kemp. We would argue, I'd do my interview, and then at the end of the day, he would say, "Let's go to the bar and retire." And he even took my 17-year-old son to the bar. I said, "Jack, he's 17. So what? Arizona Biltmore, Phoenix." And I said, "Jack, he's 17. He said, "So he's 17. What do you want?" I said, "Jack, he's 17. It's religious ceremony. What do you want?" And I gave up. And my son had his first drink thanks to Jack Kemp. Anyway, TV did kill the radio star. At least that's what MTV said. That's me in 1971, 1972. The show is called Tiger Talk, WRKL Radio. I'm in the 11th grade. Gene Delisio to my left, to your right in the picture. Doris Ham to my right. She didn't last. We had a whole bunch of girls who came through there because they didn't want to do it. It was so bad. From there, I did newspapers when I was 15 years old, and my big break in 1978, covering the Democratic fundraiser in Nyack, New York, and interviewing John Lindsay. Well, he interviewed me, basically. He told me I'm running for Senate, got me on WNEW radio when I was 22. But I stayed at WGRC for a while and listened to old-time radio. Anyway, Anna, thank you so much for inviting me. I hope everybody enjoyed it. You could open up the lines, as they say in the radio. And if anybody has any questions, we can entertain questions and not get photobombed. So I will tell everybody who wants to say something. Let me unmute people. Come on, unmute. I think, Anna, you have to unmute people. I don't think I can.
Yes.
Any questions, any comments? Lou, I think you got your iPhone on. Anybody else? Jim, you okay?
Yep, I'm okay. It's just very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. Barbara?
Take you to the forest.
Thank you.
Nice, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Evan?
Yes.
Did Marconi, and I may have missed part of it because I got in late.
Yeah.
Did Mark?
We lost you, Lou. Maybe you should type it out.
Sorry.
Okay, there you go. Well, no. You got to unmute yourself.
I'm unmuting, but unfortunately, okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Did Marconi himself have anything to do with commercial radio, establishing commercial radio stations?
No, that was Sarnoff. It was all David Sarnoff. And that was, he figured that out after the sinking of the Titanic. And Bill Paley came in, and Mutual came in, and no, it was Sarnoff. Sarnoff figured out if you are selling radios or radiolas, you better have something to sell. And that was programming. And in that sense, Sarnoff was a genius. And he applied that to television too. One of his first big deals on TV was getting baseball on TV, Columbia playing Princeton, Baker Bowl, and then getting the rights to Brooklyn Dodger games in 1939, and then putting on the NFL's Brooklyn Dodgers in 1939. So Sarnoff used sports a lot to sell his product.
He sounds like quite the entrepreneur.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know if you have any books on General Sarnoff in the library, David Sarnoff. He was a very smart individual, and I'll tell you one more story about him. Jack Benny left NBC in 1948. One thing that I was always curious about when I was doing some stuff on MSNBC up at 30 Rock was that there were no pictures of Jack Benny or Fred Allen, but Jack Benny. And Jack Benny left NBC in 1948, went to CBS, took Burns and Allen and a whole bunch of others with him, didn't take Fred Allen with him. And he held a grudge against Paley in 1965. He didn't get the National Football League on TV on NBC. CBS got that Paley. And he decided, he told Sonny Werblin, he told Sonny Werblin, who was the owner of the Jets, who had been with Lou Wasserman and MCA TV and was Elizabeth Taylor's PR person, said, how much did he get? I'm not using the exact words. And he said he got $35 million. He said, here's $35 million and $1. Go build yourself a league so we could get ratings on NBC. And he did. And ultimately, they got a merger out of it. And Sarnoff got the Super Bowl in 1967. And he got the Joe Namath game in 1969, which is really the first Super Bowl, Super Bowl III, first time it was named that. So Sarnoff used sports, he used music, he used comedians, anything to sell. Paley did the same thing. So Paley had a better news department. He had Edwin Armstrong. Anybody else? Well, if nobody else is...
I was just going to ask about...
Yeah, Jim, go ahead.
Wasn't WABC spun off, or ABC Network spun off as the Blue Network?
Yes, yes. And that was in the 1940s. NBC Red, NBC Blue, and that's why it was the American Broadcasting Company. Sarnoff had to get rid of it, and he did. So ABC Radio, which is not really in existence anymore. It is in name, but so is Westwood One in name, but they just killed Westwood One after COVID-19. They decided not to continue it going. So NBC Radio has come back, sort of, kind of. I was with NBC Radio when it was merged into Westwood One, and they decided to kill off NBC Radio. And CBS Radio is no longer owned by Viacom or CBS. It's owned by Intercom. And that was that was a deal that took a couple of years to make. Radio stations are pretty much worthless right now. You're not going to get much money for a radio station. And a number of them have gone dark.
Judging by my email, a number of prisoners in the Michigan State Penitentiary
that's
found
basically it.
Yeah, because I found a nostalgic site, website for WCBS AM, and it shows the facilities that were out on Hart Island.
The antenna.
The antenna, and then the broadcast facility, I think itself was there.
Yeah, and WABC is in Lodi, New Jersey, right off Route 17, in a swamp. Swampy land. That's good. Swampy land's good. Anybody else?
Evan,
Yeah.
what do you see the future of radio?
There is no future. It's unfortunate because I worked at a local radio station, and I covered the hurricane. It was a hurricane that came through 1978 and 79, knocked down a lot of power and all. And with a radio, you don't have to worry about the loss of towers on this thing. You don't have to worry about cable being cut off. If you have a radio and it has a battery, and I gave my kids radios, not that they own radios, but if there is an emergency.
I do.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Because my landlord gave me one in case there's an emergency.
Oh, that is the only place that you could hear what's going on. You can't hear it if there's no cell phone or cell service. You can't hear it if there's no internet service. You can't watch it if your cable is out. Although if you have an antenna, maybe if they get the antenna up and going to get the signal out. So people should be using that as a selling point. It's local, 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 local. Give us a reason to listen to you locally, but they don't. And in 1996, the Telecommunications Act, which limited people to 7 AM and 7 FM stations, 14 altogether, and then the 7 and 7, they took off. They took off the limits, and Clear Channel. Oh, let me tell you a story about Clear Channel. They bought stations. They just went out there. They got financing and buying and buying and buying and buying, and they bought 2 stations from a guy I know, Tom Wilson. 3WE in Cleveland and the station in Pittsburgh. And Tom and I were sitting at lunch one day. My wife was with us. And I say, theoretically, when they gave you $70 million for those 2 stations, what were those stations worth? He said, maybe together $7 million. He said, I'm not complaining. I live up on a hill in Malibu overlooking the Pacific Ocean now. And they went out and they spent money, and they're $20 billion in the hole, and the other one was CBS and Viacom. Now Entercom, and you have some other, but it's all syndicated. Nobody is giving you an excuse to listen to local radio. In fact, local radio doesn't exist. When I was doing local radio, our #1 rated show was the school lunch menu. That was back in 1978, 79. Toward the end of the month, because somebody would lose. It was on mimeograph paper. You took it home, and by the end of the month, where is it? I don't know where it is. It's over there. I know it's over there. But we had it, and that was our most popular show. Also, our other most popular show was snow closings. School closed, and they listened to us, and that's what I said. Give them a reason to listen. Cover the school boards, which I did, cover the county legislature, cover the local village board, which I did. And I learned a lot by doing that. That's where I broke in, knew how to do interviews. And a small station, you can make all your mistakes, nobody will notice, because they expect that. But radio, tell me somebody under the age of 25 who buys a radio. And on that note,
But even on the digital formats,
you could get your stations here on iHeart or radio.com. You could get stations, but are you going to listen to a station that somebody programs the music, or do you want to program your own music? If you got an Apple subscription, you can have whatever you want, or some other, Spotify, whatever it is. You can program your own music. You don't have to depend on somebody programming it for you. Different world, different world. Is that it?
Just following up. It's following up on that. Other than talk radio seems to have filled a niche. In other words, it's not going into the fact that we can either sell you something, or we can provide music, or we can. It's sort of becoming like a community, like a town square where people can vent at each other.
Yeah, and that's the problem. The problem is young people aren't listening to it. The problem, you talking about syndicated. If you're going to do it locally. Nobody does it locally. It's all syndicated packages from Premier Radio, which. Motorcycle went by, which sends out, I think they send out, Cumulus sends out Entity and Rush. Premier does others, but it's uninteresting radio, except, I had a guy, Gene Guga, back at the 500-watt radio station. We used to say, let's have talk radio. And he said, no, I'm not doing it. I said, why aren't you doing it? He said, well, I don't want the same 15 people calling up all the time. There are some things in talk radio that you probably don't know. One is Premier Networks actually hires voice actors. Every 60 days, you could be on a radio show. They'll hire you to make a phone call to make sure that the show is going the way it's supposed to go. And their plant calls, the host knows they're coming in, the guy who's producing the show knows they're coming in. And Premiere would take out an ad in Hollywood Reporter or whatever else. Voice actors wanted for radio shows, call-in radio shows. And that's, you know, and you got X amount of dollars, keep the show going, make the host look good, get into a fight with the host, whatever it was. But that's part of the radio business. Doesn't all seem to be what it is. And it's Premiere. I had a friend who did that, got paid like $100 for a phone call. And he would do it every 60 days on this show and that show. And he'd do it about 5 times a month on various shows. You know, and they spread them out. It's the same thing with some people that go on these TV shows, the talk shows on TV. And they'll show up as a character on one show or a character on another show. It's Jerry Springer show, whatever it is. And, you know, it's okay. I mean, it's accepted practice, and it's been accepted practice forever, at least through the talk genre. Yeah, which started with WNBC Radio in New York.
How valid are the ratings services for these shows when they announce, so we had this and we had that, and this number and that number?
All right, let me tell you a story about a guy by the name of John Landers. John Landers was a transit worker. He's a white guy, transit worker. And he was part of Arbitron. And he had to fill out a diary. And he would tell the diary, now it's a little different because it's computerized. But back in the day, you kept it in the notebook. And he would fill out, listen to WWLR radio, gospel radio, gospel radio, gospel radio. And I said, why'd you do that for? He said, they don't know. I'm having a little fun. So, you know, nobody really knows what radio ratings are. I mean, nobody knows at all. I mean, somebody will say, well, I get 20 million listeners. Maybe, probably not. Nobody seems to know. I mean, we, you know, they claim, well, X amount. How do they know? How do they know? I mean, you know, unless you got a radio chip in or a computer chip in your radio, they don't know. So it's all best guess. That's basically it, the best guess. We think X amount of people are listening. But Herb Oscar Anderson, when he was on WABC radio back in the 60s, said he never paid attention to ratings. He paid attention to the fan mail, how much fan mail he got. And he got a lot of fan mail. So he said that was a more apt way for him anyway to judge his ratings. But yeah, when I was a kid, WMCA in New York, WABC in New York were the two top 40 pop music stations. And, you know, teenagers listened to it. A lot of Clearasil ads. But I remember as a 7-year-old listening to B. Mitchell Reed every night. But that was me as a 7-year-old. So, 19.
Thank you very much for this. This was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. And can you imagine if I brought notes with me?
Have you thought about doing a book on
No, I'm not going to do it. I mean, you know, there are people who have done all kinds of books on radio, and you know, at this point in my life, the people who I would really want to speak to are long gone. I mean, the exception is cousin Brucey, who's 84 years old, and I got a story about that. My friend Mitch Levy, who's at WINS Radio doing some news for WINS, was a teenage disc jockey with WINS back in the 50s. And I always, when I see Mitch, I always say the same thing. I said, why wasn't it you? Why was it cousin Brucey? And he's on WINS, and Bruce Morowitz just graduated NYU. And Mitch is on, and he's 16, 17 at the time. This is WINS Radio, and he introduces the world to Bruce Morowitz, who would then become cousin Brucey, cousin Bruce Morrow and all. And I said, if it wasn't for you, Mitch, we never would have heard of cousin Brucey. And Mitch just laughs. He said, no, we would have heard of cousin Brucey. He had too much talent. And Mitch went on to a masterful career doing news on radio, on various radio stations, Bloomberg. I think he was on WINS. He's on WINS now. He was all over the place. And Mitch was such a great guy. In 1990, during the baseball lockout, I brought my 5-year-old son with me, and he was reading books and all, but we were there for a long time. I figured we'd only be there for a half hour. And he's sitting in the corner, and he's bored. And Mitch had a deck of cards. And Mitch played cards with my 5-year-old son, kept him entertained. And I've known Mitch for a long time. And he did introduce Cousin Brucey to the radio world. I think it's 1958, somewhere around there. 1959. He was also on with, he took Alan Freed's place at a sock hop because Alan Freed was indicted for payola. So they sent Mitch out to take his place back then. Mitch is the guy who should write the book because he's got all the stories. He knows everything. But Wolfman Jack is dead. And people like that. Ibis is dead. Johnny Blue Jack is dead. So those are the people who I'd want to talk to if I ever did a book. And, you know, they've given interviews over the years to a lot of people. Is that it? If that's it, I want to thank everybody. First, let's thank Anna for inviting me tonight. I hope you enjoyed the early days of radio. There's not much of an audience for it anymore, so which is unfortunate. 25 years ago, there was a lot of audience for it. Unfortunately, it is passed. They have passed on. So I hope that everybody enjoyed it. And again, there are books out there. And there are books about Orson Welles where you can find out all you want about the War of the Worlds. One other thing about Orson Welles, he was working for both NBC and CBS back in those days. And their studios were apart. And he had 15 minutes in between shows. You had to get from CBS to NBC, 30 Rock, or somewhere else. And what's the quickest way around Manhattan? Rent an ambulance. They don't stop you. He used to rent an ambulance. They'd put him in the back. The sirens would go. They'd go through the lights, and he'd get to his other place within 10 minutes. They'd drop him off, and he was there. He just rented an ambulance to get from place to place. Orson Welles, which I think is kind of innovative when you're doing two networks or producing shows for two networks. Anyway, again, I want to thank you. And Anna, the floor is all yours.
Thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate all of your patience during the shenanigans earlier. This has been recorded, so if you got here a bit late, we'll be putting it on our YouTube page. Expect that in the next couple days. Thank you so much.
Okay, and thank you, Jim and Lou and everybody else who was here. And for those who are going to watch it on YouTube, thank you for watching us on YouTube. Thank you to Anna. I'm Edwin Weiner. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.